Every now and again, a film comes along that just kind of, well, clicks, right? I've actually talked about this concept before when it comes to a few films. In fact, as weird as this is probably going to sound, I've mentioned this before with regards to films in this very show. I've mentioned how sometimes a film comes together, and by all rights, it shouldn't have been as amazing as it was, and then yet somehow it is, right? I actually refer to, in my head, I refer to this as Star Wars effect. I don't call it that out loud because obviously there's just too many other things that could be associated with. But that's this film, as far as I'm concerned. By all rights, this film should not have been anywhere near as good as it is. This is a film that languished for an enormous amount of time, that they started the beginning works of what would become the development of what would become this film in 1998. They started principal photography, I should say finished principal photography for this film in 2012. 14 years of off and on, switching studios, switching development cycles, switching actors, switching writers, switching production, pulling people out of retirement just to work on this film. Just out of nowhere, and it didn't even come out till 2015. And the best part is that we have yet another example of oh my gosh, a Princess Bride effect going on here. I swear that half the movies I'm covering this month, or excuse me, this year, are Princess Bride effect films, because this film, it got back into the black. You know, it made back its budget, but that's it. And yet it swept every award ceremony, and it is still to this very day critically acclaimed, because this is a good film. Now, you may not like it, and that's totally acceptable, and it may not be your thing, and that's totally acceptable, but it's very easy to see why so many people derived such enjoyment from this one. It's also easy to see why nobody really wanted to see it in the box office. I mean, oh gee, they're making another Mad Max film. Oh yeah, that's another thing I want to see, is yet another 80s and 90s property being redone in the modern era. Woo. Wait, it's actually good? Huh? Right? This was a shocker, and I think that's one of the reasons why so many people kept talking about it for so long, is because it's not just that it's the best film ever, but rather that it is a good film, and no one expected it to be. I also have to say, as I've been looking into this, there's two other things I feel like pointing out when it comes to the specific presentation of this film. First of all, they had a lot of emphasis on practical effects. Now, obviously, they did use CGI, but when I say that, I mean they used CGI how, in my opinion, CGI should be used for live-action films. And that's, for lack of a better way to put it, touching up. Now, that's not always true. Anytime there's a legitimate CGI effect, it's so obvious because so many of the other effects are practical. You know, the wheel flying at the screen, or the car being flipped, you know. These are, I know what you're saying. The car being flipped? Which one? There's like 30 cars that get flipped. No, you probably know the one I'm talking about if you are aware of what I'm referring to. If you're not, don't worry about it. But either way, they stand out. But for the most part, the CGI was mostly just used to touch up backdrops or little tidbits and touches here and there in order to try and, you know, add to the development of the film. And in my opinion, that is what you should do, again, with regards to a live-action film. So that's something that got a lot of people talking. This is also uniquely suited because in 2015, there was a kind of a push against heavy CGIization, which had been happening for, at that point, almost a decade. Because so many films got on board the CGI bandwagon and then stayed there. The other thing I want to talk about is they had a team on board. Now, plenty of films have this kind of a team, but it's a team of people whose only job is keeping track of what happens where in relative to other scenes when it comes to the movie. Now, that may sound like a strange thing, but please remember, films are not filmed linearly. That's not how filmmaking works. You film the scenes that you can in the order that you can with regards to sets, with regards to location shots, with regards to, you know, any changes that need to happen with regards to the actors. You know, you film them in a specific order based on what you have available to you. To use an example right off the top of my head, the first Hobbit film, the first scene they filmed in the entire film was the interaction between Bilbo Baggins and Gollum. That was the first thing they filmed, something that's like 2/3 of the way through the film. So a continuity team, there's various terms for these kind of guys, but I like to call them, continuity team. They're usually referred to as the internal consistency team, which I think makes a degree of sense as well. Their team, their entire purpose and job is to try and make sure everything lines up between scenes. Now, there's a couple of mistakes here and there in this film, but only a couple. There's a huge amount of attention to detail to make sure, especially in the action sequences, that events line up so that nitpickers or even casual viewers won't notice, well, hang on, wasn't he over there in the previous scene? Or maybe he was over... Hang on a second. And so so they do a really good job is what I'm trying to say. And it makes the film look a lot more consistent than it otherwise would. Before I talk about the film itself, I want to mention one other film-making trick that they used in this one. Right towards the beginning, there's this bit where Max is trying to escape from the Citadel. And as he's trying to escape, how many of you thought that scene looked a little bit off? How many of you noticed is actually what I'm really asking. Now, I imagine if you're watching this, you probably have an interest in the film and probably already know what I'm talking about. But what the editors and directors did was they pulled out frames out of the sequence. So it doesn't look stuttery, but it doesn't look smooth. It doesn't look realistic because literally frames have been removed from the footage. So it just kind of has this continuous pseudo-skipping nature to it. In other words, this is something that they were doing deliberately, and they only do for this section, really, to show the mental state of Max at this particular point in time as he is frantically trying to escape. It's good stuff. This film is, in my opinion, one of the best uses of Max as a character concept. Because, in my opinion, Max is best used not as the main character, but rather as the viewpoint character going through someone else's story. And this, I feel, is one of the better concepts when it comes to this setting, the Mad Max setting, the post-apocalypse doom, right? Because there's a lot... Let's be honest with ourselves. The reason why so many different stories and so many different aspects of fiction have done so many post-apocalypse stories is there's so much you can do with that. There is a tremendous amount of human interest and concept in society and just all sorts of stories you can do with a post-apocalypse. It's, in my opinion, one of the reasons why people keep going back to that particular well. And so... well, how do you have your cake and eat it too? Because viewers, and players, but viewers in this case, really like to have a degree of contiguous characterization when it comes to these kind of settings. In other words, they want to keep playing Gordon Freeman in future Half-Life games, to use a parallel here. So what they do is they have Mad Max drift in and out of other people's stories, so we're still following Max, but we actually now have the ability to see all of those different viewpoints that the post-apocalypse allows. So, brilliant stuff in its own right. Because, let's be honest, Furiosa is the main character of this particular film. I think we can all acknowledge that. There's nothing... I'm not even sure I've ever heard anyone actually debate that one. Max is the first party member that she gets in her party, you know what I mean? Before we talk about the film proper, I want to talk about some things about the setting. First of all, there's some implications, and a lot of showing, not telling happens in this film. So a lot of this is speculative, and some of it's based on some of the behind-the-scenes interviews and, of course, the novelization. But one of the things that's posited is that Max, and as a consequence, Morton Joe, just Joe, let's be honest with ourselves, that both of them are what we would call first-geners. In other words, both of them were still alive before things got really bad, like super mega bad. Now, that would mean that this is still relatively new into this new era. 10, 20, maybe 30 years after the metaphorical bombs fell. Now, the specific timing of that isn't relevant, but I bring that up because that, again, helps to solidify this solidly as post-apocalypse. There's no possibility of post-post yet, because no one started rebuilding, really. Like what we see in this with the triad of towns is probably the closest thing we see to what might eventually become a state or a nation across these films. At least in my opinion. Which brings me to my next point. Joe's decision to segregate the power base is actually quietly brilliant in its own right. I say decision. I don't know if that was actually a deliberate point or not, because again, show don't tell, so a lot of this is speculation and inference. But think about it for a moment. You don't want your water anywhere near your production, right? You don't want all of your power to be in one spot so everyone can take it if they have to. But you yourself want to hold on to the strongest point of power, which isn't guns or gas, but water. So he splits up water, gas, guns, or bullets, actually. And with the three of these things, he now has a recurrent trade arc between these three. He has resources which he can utilize in order to try and ensure that each of them profit and trade off of each other. It's surprisingly well built, considering there's a lot of implication that Joe himself was a formal military personnel prior to the metaphorical bombs. It would make sense that he has this kind of logistics-oriented, militaristic mind in order to be able to organize his own little fiefdom here. I'm not trying to praise the man, it's worth noting, because he's a disgusting human being who I'm actually very happy that his face was literally ripped off. But I do want to say, spoiler, I do want to say that it's interesting the power dynamic he has set up. This is why I say this is the closest thing to a nation we've seen, because I know this is going to sound so strange, but this is probably the closest thing to an actual stable situation that we've seen. And this is a mess. But I mean, that's what they were left with after all. I do have to wonder, how long is that aquifer going to last? Anyways. So. Wow, where to begin? First of all, Max himself, obviously the same character from the previous ones, inferences and flashbacks, and he's insane, blah, blah, blah. But Max himself, he's interesting because he comes across as someone who occasionally breaches the surface of the water. The rest of the time he spends drowning. They call him feral, and I think that's an apt term. But he's clearly capable of completely uniform and understandable speech. Again, a first-gener. He was a cop back in the day. So obviously this guy was, for lack of a better way to put it, high school educated, right? Probably knows more about more than most of the people in this setting do right now, along with other first-geners. So a lot of his presentation makes sense, and I want to give special praise to Tom Hardy, because Tom Hardy's a good actor, but also it's funny how many times he slips into Bane for this one. Is that just me? Anyways. So we get to the Citadel itself, where, of course, they have not quite functioning machinery. They do have the mechanisms that might otherwise function as machinery. They just have nothing to power them. And they don't want to waste the water on that. That would be insanely wasteful. I mean, that would be like pouring out gallons and gallons of water out just onto the dirt and the mud for people to pick up in pails. I get it. I do. It's not about actually giving water to the people. It's about giving them enough water so they fight each other rather than him. A method of maintaining control and nothing more. They obviously do utilize the water they have access to internally quite well, since they do have crops and green and growing, and they do actually maintain a decent amount of, I don't know what to call that, infrastructure. Again, agriculture is actually probably a better term, and we see signs of this repeatedly. So the water he spills out, that's just basically his own tax on him, on that the people are technically putting on him in order for him to maintain his control over them. Because, let's be honest, no matter what the position of power, that large a throng of a people is going to be a problem if they actually start to rebel. Simple thing there. I mentioned this here. I actually have the way I put my notes here is, so they waste the water, they think of short-term control rather than long-term betterment. But on the plus side, they do have flamethrower guitars, so, I mean, take that into account. There's a whole lot of, yeah, cool, in this film, and I'm totally okay with that. I put on my sunglasses, but, different concept, different type of cool. But I guess it just bothers me a little bit how much Joe himself and those of his upper echelons really are only interested in control. Joe himself is fanatically interested in trying to sire a healthy male child. You'll notice that they never mention what happens to the female children, by the way. Yeah. Also, he has women that he refers to as his property, and other women who are his milkers, God, or milkies? God, I don't even know what to call that. It's putting a bad taste in my mouth just thinking about this whole situation, because Joe has basically turned everyone below him into someone that services him. Now, we know Joe's dying. He's got tumors. His body is flabby and weak, and he's dying. He's even got a shell in the form of muscle, so that people from a distance think he's still strong and great, even though he's, I'd say, probably a year out from dying. And we've seen two of his existing children, one of whom is barely functional and mentally, and the other one's barely functional physically. So, so obviously he wants a human child. I almost, as weird as this may sound, I find myself wondering why. That's probably one of the only points of his plan that doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, everything he does is repellent and abhorrent and repulsive, but at least there's a logic to it. His methods of control, his establishment of enslavement, he utilizes effectively a religious zealousism. That's a new word I just came up with. You can use it too. In order to try and establish his control. You know, I am the one who will lead you into the gates of Valhalla. Everyone shall ride fury, witness me. You know, all the cult stuff that he does in order to try and ensure people all venerate him and venerate the process and the simple way he's working. What exactly is his interest in having a healthy male child? Is it just because there's no one else healthy at all to take over? Is it because he actually wants someone to take over this in general? I mean, I know that sounds so strange, but Joe's overall methods are so focused on himself and the now rather than the then, that I find myself wondering why he gives a crap about the next generation whatsoever. Unless he literally just thinks that only my blood can contain for, like, in other words, he starts to believe his own hype, in other words. I suppose that's entirely possible. I wasn't accounting for the possibility of crazy in my calculations. Please forgive me. I do find it interesting how, what's a good word here, programmed people are to follow orders. Notice that when Furiosa just kind of tilts off, everyone's just completely with it. And then when they see the bad guys coming in, they're just saying, all right, woo! And then they work together for quite a while to fight them, and no one questions her one whit, until finally she refuses to turn off. That's the first moment at which she has to finally start killing basically her own men there. Although, let's be honest, they're Joe's men, not her men. I mention that because I find myself wondering how much of that is the more fanaticism. You know, again, he really basically has built a religion around himself and venerating him, and quite literally has built a built-in religious thing for people to die in his name and in his service. There's a reason they're called half-lives, right? But at the same time, he also has control of basically all the resources. All the resources they want and all the resources they need. So it's entirely feasible that both of these things, two combined, lead to his overall method of control. And I bring that up because a lot of his group tends to work surprisingly well in teams. Now, I bring that up because this just kept occurring to me as I was going through this film over and over. I was like, wow, they're exhibiting surprisingly good teamwork. They're actually working together quite well, in the way that you wouldn't imagine, random savages banding together to work well. I mean, to use the old stereotype of the Raiders from the Fallout series, for example, they don't exactly work well in a group because it's just a bunch of thugs roaming in a direction. But here, we have actual military tactics, formation, different call signs, different audio signs. They've got the war drums and the guitar in order to indicate certain things, and they've got a surprisingly organized structure. And I actually facepalmed when I realized it because it was so simple, because of course they do. Ex-military, right? So Joe obviously has drilled this kind of thing into these people. Now, having said that, it's interesting to me as well, because I don't know if that's all that is. Because another thing I noticed is, within a relatively short period of time, the girls, Furiosa, Max, and Nux, all end up working together pretty damn well. And later on, when you add the women from the green place as well, all of them also end up working well together pretty smoothly and efficiently. This is getting into theory crafting territory, but one of the things I've always perceived, is the word I want to use there, is that human beings work better in a group. Now, I mean, that sounds like a duh, because if you take a human and you put them into total isolation, that is literally torture. Human beings need social interaction in order to properly function, on some level or another. That's not what I mean, though. What I mean is that I feel like one of our greatest advantages when it comes to simple survival is our capacity to coordinate and interact with each other. We have tremendous communicative possibilities, not just with the words that I'm speaking to you right now, but everything I'm doing, the tone, the presentation, the little movements. We here at EA, all this little stuff that we do in order to communicate with each other gives us an enormous advantage. And I bring that up because I feel like this is mostly one of the more interesting takes on survivalism I've ever seen. Because so often fiction points at survivalism and says it's all about the individual. We'll be talking about this just next week when it comes to Interstellar. And yet, when it comes to a group, like this group works well together because they need each other. Because each one of them has a skill set. Because each one of them cannot do this by themselves. And thus, this is most obvious between Max and Furiosa, the two of whom are basically the heavies of this group. And yet both of them constantly find themselves more and more and more working together and helping each other because they need to. Right? Now, granted, that's not how it started. The kill switch, forcing him to have to let her on and blah, blah, blah. And that leading to other bad stuff. But you can kind of see how once they were basically forced together, they functionally became a unit. Because now that they're together, well, now they need each other to survive, right? I also like to think that at least a little bit of Max was grateful for company that wasn't ghosts screaming into his visions. Just my thoughts on that one. Anyways, they get to the point where they go into the dust storm. I'll be talking about that next week, too. They do a really good job of making it look as absolutely horrifying as it should. Dust tornadoes and dust lightning, and the camera just zooming out and out and out as you see more and more of this monstrous thing. The fact that she drove in there shows how desperate she is. The fact that Joe followed her, it just shows how dedicated he is to my children and my property. I want to mention the music now, because the music is really good in this film, in my opinion. You may or may not like it, but I do think it's very well constructed. One of the things they do consistently is they have a beat to the music. There's a very consistent beat to almost every song. It's not always drums, though. It's usually drums whenever the actual drums truck is nearby. But instead, sometimes they use strings for that, sometimes they use choir, sometimes they use, the typical da-da-da-da-da. But there's always some kind of beat going throughout almost the entire film as far as its soundtrack. Helps keep the pace up and kind of keep the, for lack of a better term, the heartbeat of the film running at the pace that it should. I also want to mention how surprisingly non-gory this film is. It's interesting. Now, what do I want to talk about next? Let's talk about the ship thing. This never occurred to me before, really, and I can't believe it didn't. But these are ships. I mean, yeah, they're vehicles that have been grafted together, very well designed, by the way, and they drive instead of go on the ocean. But these are ships. In almost every way, they treat them as naval vessels. And it just, as soon as that clicked with me, I realized why I enjoy the, for lack of a better way to put it, combat sequences so much, because that's how they approach it. Each of these ships has their own anti-ship weapons. People crawl all over the ships on a regular basis to yell at the helmsman or go back in order to try and board the other ship, and crawling under while the ship is still moving to perform repairs and maintenance and mechanics. The way they treat it is naval. And I am a bit of a ship guy. And this is one of the reasons why I love that concept. I don't know how to describe it, but there's something really engaging about treating these things like that. Because, that's not how you treat a car, right? You just drive a car and it gets you from point A to point B. And if something happens, well, you pull over to the side of the road and you try and fix it or whatever. And you get back in the car and you go. That's not how they treat these. Now, that also kind of makes you go, because it makes you wonder how the hell they have enough fuel to drive for as long as that car. But let's just ignore that for a moment. 3,000 gallons of fuel. Yeah, that's not coming back. Anyways. It would be easy to see why some of the women would be tempted to go back willingly. I'm not saying for or against. In fact, I think that's an absolutely goddamn horrible idea. But the idea of, back there, they were treated as property, but at least they didn't have this. Let me put it to you this way. It's one thing to say, "I believe in freedom." It is a much different thing to actually try and obtain that, when you have to with all of the blood and pain and horror that that entails. It's one of the reasons why revolutions, historically speaking, usually only happen because people are pushed past the limit, past the boundary of what they can accept. Because then that pain and blood is suddenly an acceptable cost. Make sense? And you can kind of see why, for all of the crap that they've been through on this trip, they would then, be tempted, screw it, I'm just going back home. It's not even a logical presumption. It's not even their actual minds talking. It's just, I'm done with this. I'm done with this. I'm going home. This is about when Nux really comes into the film. I haven't talked about him much because there's not a lot of characterization in this film, honestly. There's really only characterization for 4 people, and I've already talked about one of them. But Nux is probably my favorite character in this film. I know, right? He's weirdly innocent. It's just so bizarre for someone who is a war boy, someone who is a zealot convert, someone who desperately wants to die, witness me, And yet he comes across as someone who barely understands or knows anything. There's a ridge up over that thing. It's called a tree. Yeah, the tree thing. He doesn't even know what a tree is. Keep in mind, there probably are trees around where he is. It's just, he is kept so in the dark as far as his education that he doesn't know what a tree is. It's such a minor point, but that really resonated with me because, again, that goes back to the forms of control I mentioned earlier. That Joe keeps his subjects in deliberate squalor, not just physically, but mentally. And historically speaking, there's a lot of precedence for that, too. I do like how his connection with the red-haired one, I'm sorry, I don't know their names. They almost never say their names in this one. Kind of develops. Not the romantic side of things, I don't care about that, but rather the fact that she, who is someone who could obviously have pity on this innocent child, could take him in, and he can then embrace her as something better than what he had before. As he himself says, if the cysts don't get me, well, he doesn't say cyst because you know what a cyst is, but if the cysts don't get me, the night fevers will. Yeah. And I just got to give huge praise to the guy playing Nux, by the way. He really does do an excellent portrayal of someone who is... I don't have a better word for it, I'm sorry. Innocent. He gives an excellent portrayal of innocence. I like how there's this one bit where Angarad, or whatever her name is, was going to die. Sorry, I'm saying this wrong. Was going to live, actually. She ended up dying. She ended up dying because the actress actually did get pregnant, so they kind of wrote her out of the script. I'm kind of curious how the rest of the film would have been changed by that. I don't know, because they spent several scenes acknowledging that, so credit where credit is due. They do turn the death into something. Anti-seeds, yeah. So then they go out, the bullet farmer guy shows up. He's blinded, that's nice. There's this wonderful, wonderful bit. It's probably the most violent bit, I'd say the second most violent bit in the film, and it's all off camera. Because Max wanders off, and there's this great bit, what do I do if you don't come back? You go on. He says it's so duh, like, of course you'd go without me. Why would you stay for me? Duh, God, I'm out, peace. Then he comes back with a lot of guns and some equipment, and they're like, what? Are you okay? What? Yeah, why? You've got a lot of blood on you. Oh, don't worry. It's not his blood. Anyways. So then we get to the bit with the mirrors. There's this woman, a naked woman, of course, although they don't really show anything. If they actually show anything, I didn't see it, but whatever. That's not the point, because there's a naked woman in a bunch of bars who, and you notice this, there's a lot of mirrors dangling from it. I love Max's because, that's bait. That's bait. Of course it is! And yet, of course, you could probably understand why it's so effective bait. And given that they were driven out of the green area, you could probably see why it is they decided to do this. Because this is effectively the Venus flytrap approach. Okay? Well, we're going to stay in this relatively defensible area that we know well, and we're going to try and lure people here in order to salvage off of them. Makes sense. I do find myself wondering how long they've been there, though. Oh yeah, quick aside. I actually read a nice article done by a gentleman who was talking about why the green would have turned into the muck. He's far smarter than I, and I can't possibly summarize it properly. But apparently, the idea of the nearby fracking operation, which is probably going on with regards to both the water and the oil generation, probably would actually lead to this kind of environmental destabilization of the nearby area, turning it from a greenland into a swamp. So that's actually apparently fairly logical and accurate. And, turning the dirt sour so it no longer, can bear fruit. Yeah, again, all sense making. So just credit where credit is due on that one. But anyways, there's this nice bit. This one really stuck with me. The elder woman says, back then, there was no need to snap anybody. Now, that implies two very important things. Obviously, this woman is a first-gener. I mean, if Max is a first-gener, so is she. But I bring this up because, first of all, the implication is obvious, that the only way to survive now is by killing, which is effectively a salvaging scenario, a fully parasitic society, in other words. Now, I could go into length and depths about why that's not a long-term viability and why that'll eventually lead to destruction and blah, blah, blah. But let's get off that, because, sorry. Because I think we could all understand that one. Now, what I want to bring up is the idea that back then, there was no need to snap anybody. They did anyways. It's not preachy. It doesn't shove it into your face. It doesn't sit there and linger on the moment. And she doesn't emphasize it the way I just did. She doesn't say, back then there was no need to snap anyone. She doesn't say it like that. She just says it very calmly and normally. The implication is then left there for us to ponder. That in a world where everyone had fruit, where everyone had food, they still decided to massacre and murder each other to the point where they basically destroyed the planet. With that fun thought out of the way, there's a really, really nice bit where Max decides, they give him a motorcycle fully decked out. Thank you. This is your cut for helping us. He goes after them, probably because of the visions. But before he does that, he and she talk for a bit. And she says, we're going to go out to the salt. A couple things about that. First of all, there's a lot of implication, although not outright statement, that the salt is what used to be the ocean. Just think about that for a minute. Just really think about that. You guys ever play Half-Life 2? How the ocean levels have lowered by several meters? You think that's impressive? Imagine the ocean being lowered to the point where it's just salt. Think about that. Now, my own personal headcanon is that the ocean levels have been lowered substantially, but they're still there. So in other words, if she were to drive straight east or whatever, she would eventually hit a point where the new ocean is. But, that's going to be way the hell out there, isn't it? That's a hell of a drive. Second point, he says, if you don't fix what's broken, you'll go insane. This is why I gave my earlier characterization for Max himself. Because Max and Furiosa are both, in many ways, in the same boat. They are both people who are not evil. See, this is what's really interesting about them, to me. They're not evil. They're just living here. What I mean by that is someone who is evil, someone who is selfish or greedy or cruel or malicious or power-hungry or whatever, would have taken advantage of this situation a dozen times over. But neither she nor he do. Now, they're not good. They don't do things completely out of charity. They don't do things just because it's the right thing to do. But you can tell how both people probably would be good if the world had been a better place, right? And that it's a unique perspective on it. I shouldn't say unique. That's a wrong word. It's a perspective I enjoy. The kind of person who would have been a good person in a better world is something that I find to be an interesting character type, especially in a situation like this, because you can tell how much it bothers both of them to try and hurt or destroy other people who don't deserve it, and how much they are bothered by their own failings. There's a reason he's still hit by those visions, because it bothers him. And that's one of the biggest definitions for someone who is a better person, that they care. If he didn't care, I failed to save all those people, but whatever. That's not a good person, is it? And so he tells her flat out, if you don't fix what's broken, you'll go insane. And we can see how she could become so much worse than what he is, because he's already going through that. He then decides, of course, all right, fine. I'm going to go help. And what I love about it is, even though it comes across as a heroic act, and let's be honest, it is, it is still partially selfish because both he and she are after the same thing: redemption. It is never stated, and it never needs to be, just how many horrible things both of these people have done. And that's another character point I do admittedly enjoy, that only the people who are capable and willing to do horrible things, and yet nevertheless do not want to, can be the ones to help guide and shepherd the others in this kind of a horrible situation. If they were evil, if they were selfish or cruel or malicious, then they wouldn't care about helping the other people. They would just take advantage of them, like Joe did. If they were not capable of doing the horrible, deadly, destructive things they do, then they would be one of the people who needs to be shepherded, because they wouldn't be capable of doing anything for themselves or for others. They have to have that specific spot in the middle. And so we see the two dark people seeking redemption to shelter the innocent. I very much enjoy that. And of course, I suppose I should point out the obvious irony that Max is a universal donor. So then they go back, and there's an excellent action sequence. As usual, I just don't have much to say about action sequences when it comes to these ruminations. So there's a really long, protracted final battle. Nux sacrifices himself, witness me. And F. And that is the end of Nux. He does die. What's really funny to me, though, and this is just me, is that Nux really wanted to die, die for glory on the Fury Road, right? Die glorious. And it was all for Joe, right? It was all for a petty, petulant, old, fat, worthless, dying bastard who didn't give a lick about him. And I could say that with 100% certainty because the film bothers to have a scene where he says, I can do it, I can go get him. And, Joe gives him the speech, oh, yes, I'll be waiting for you in Valhalla, spray, spray. And then, he goes and fails, and Joe's just like, mediocre. Immediately discards him. He doesn't care about him. He doesn't give a damn about him. But then he decides to sacrifice himself, like he always wanted to, given that he has already implied, more than once to be dying. So he sacrifices himself, and he does it for people who actually do care about him. For, well, let's call it what it is, a good cause. I find something very satisfying about the innocent was able to turn his life around and still obtain his goal, but do so for a better purpose, or perhaps for a better reason. So then they head off, and of course Max slips back into the crowd, and Furiosa's now in charge of fixing a horribly broken society. Not a job I'd want, I'll admit, although at least the leaders of all three towns died over the course of this, so that's something. You can kind of tell that Joe really was obsessed with this whole child thing because he took his entire force out, which is a huge tactical mistake. Select all A move is generally not considered good tactics. Anyways, last I checked, and I did look into this a little bit, there was a lot of desire to continue this film and do some more sequels from it. From actors, from directors, obviously from us. And given the fact that Mad Max was a critical success, the next film might actually be a financial success as well. We'll see how that goes, because there's currently lawsuits circling about for that one. But for the moment, I leave you with my thoughts as is, that I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time, guys.